thank you again to all the speakers. It's been a great set of talks on geomorphology and novel methods. And I can open it up to people for questions, or I can ask a question.
Thanks. So Maria, my question is about the CDOM data that we showed and the really cool changing of the peak discharge, which I think is migrating more towards May, March, like 150 days. And also we know CDOM gets a big sink of CDOM is photo degradation and microbial respiration. So as we see that peak move more in cooler temperature season, how will that impact the CDOM in the ocean?
Yes, this is a very good question. It's a very good question because it has to do with light availability in the water column, right? As well as microbial processing, and both are impacted by seasons and the temperature of the water as well. Of course, the temperature is also going to be affected, right? Warming earlier in late spring, early summer. So this is why it's important to integrate these observations into models, because only within coupled hydrodynamic biogeochemical models we can really say what will be the relative importance of some of these processes and how this material will eventually be transformed during transport to the coastal ocean. And now we're in the process of integrating these observations and improving these parameterizations based on the rates we measure during these experiments.
First of all, thank you very much. Excellent presentation. Been learning a lot. And I've also noticed something that to me is important is the use of radar remote sensing. So in all the presentations here, you've been using optical, but the science that you're doing in the models are about discharge at the end, right? So how is it that no one uses the capabilities that exist already, like Sentinel-1, SWOT, even a LiDAR, ISAT-2, and so on? What's forbidding about that new technology that exists?
I mean, in my presentation, I didn't include this because it was focusing mostly on carbon dynamics, organic matter that we can get from optical data sets. But definitely as part of other field campaigns, the Evolve field campaign program has been including a lot of SAR, right, microwave data sets, to better understand discharge, as well as SAR is really useful to better characterize vegetation characteristics, right, the vegetation technology as well. And this is something that we thought we would be able to include, for example, in future adventures of orbital missions, including Forte, where we would like to capture some of these processes, for sure. And as part of some other work we've been doing in my group, in other coastlines and river deltas, we've been trying to integrate measurements from SAR with measurements from optical sensors, both to better capture changes in wetland vegetation characteristics, but also link this terrestrial carbon to aquatic carbon and understand better the fluxes between the land and the ocean.
What I meant is more, it's the observation of the hydrodynamic processes with. So I know vegetation may be a simpler version, but the hydrodynamic process.
Oh, I was just going to say, thanks, Mark. That's a great question. And I think that's something we should be doing because, like I was talking about the POC, just calculating POC fluxes through deltas. It's very difficult because we often have a gauging station upstream of the distributary channels or in one channel. And so SWOT, I think, is a really powerful tool that we can then use to maybe partition POC through the deltas. But yeah, we should be doing that.
I'll just repeat what she just said, and the technical challenges of measuring discharge in a large tidal river, it's really hard. I didn't talk about that, but we've spent a lot of time going back and forth across the mouth of the Amazon for like 16 hours going back and forth to catch the tidal reversal on our ADCP. And like, we only have, you know, let's say we've done 8 campaigns, so we have 8 measurements of discharge at the mouth of the river. If we could extrapolate that with satellite data, that'd be super useful. And we've also found that it doesn't map straight to the upstream gauge. It's not necessarily that, you know, there's mismatches. You gain and lose water along the tidal river too in weird ways. So I think, you know, in that example, you could easily use satellites. The mouth of the river is 12 kilometers wide. So the resolution thing isn't a problem like it would be in a small creek.
Hello. So my question is actually direct to Matthias' work. So maybe this is my there's a misunderstanding. So so for your work, actually some seems implying that like Arctic delta is especially like efficient to store organic carbon. So what's kind of like traits or characteristics of this Arctic delta to make them so efficient to store organic carbon? Or that's because there are some like problems in measurements in deltas of other regions. So whether they maybe explore or not very like completely understanding the organic carbon storage in like in a delta in other regions. So could you comment on that? Thank you.
So, yeah, thank you. So what is unique in Arctic deltas in terms of storage, carbon storage? Is that correct? Like, yeah. Why is it so high in Arctic deltas?
Yeah. So why is so high in organic carbon like storage in Arctic delta? So why we can't find organic carbon this kind of like storage in other regions?
So first, I think you find high carbon storage also in other wetland and delta regions. Arctic deltas or the Arctic in general has high carbon storage because you have very low decomposition rates, right? So it's just cold for 8 months of the year or frozen, so not much happens. And then you have this carbon buried in a permafrost soil. So that means it just accumulates and it does not get degraded anymore.
Yeah, but you can find from the Gannis work, actually the POC export actually is a linear proportion to the like primary production in the like catchment. So that means that for the other regions, because they have a higher primary production, so the POC export also much higher. However, their organic carbon storage actually is lower. So this is like a mismatch. So maybe you have some insights of why they have this kind of difference. What factor contributed that? So maybe this is the area we need to actually figure out.
Yeah, I don't know why there's a mismatch. Also, like if we talk about Arctic deltas and carbon storage, that's not carbon that's accumulated for the last 100 years. It's like 10, 20,000 years. All right. The time scale is like really, really long. So that's the reason we have this high carbon storage. The primary productivity in the Arctic is lower. So we don't have that. We don't have higher primary productivity than in wetlands, lower latitudes or deltas and lower latitudes. But just because it doesn't get degraded, that's like the main part. We just have low decomposition rate and it gets accumulated or buried in permafrost. So it's frozen. It's freeze locked. And for lower latitude deltas, I don't know, somebody else has a comment on that.
This one.
That's better.
Okay, this microphone's okay. Great. I had a question for Courtney. I really enjoyed your quantification of the change in marsh habitat over time. And when you were talking about that, you briefly mentioned that these habitats are becoming more fractured. So I'm wondering if you ever actually, like, is that just an inference that you made based on the aerial change, or are there any like established methodologies to sort of track changes in like connectivity in habitat over time?
Yeah.
Specifically using remote sensing data.
Great question. Definitely really interesting. I think, at the beginning of the project, I thought we might have time to look at sort of spatial connections, but then, using the final classified maps to see what kind of patterns we see. And there is some literature on a small scale, right, that show, once the wetland starts to break apart or you get like widening pools of water, right, widening channels, then they start to break down more rapidly. There is a product called the unvegetated vegetated ratio that I'm really interested in looking at and comparing to our maps to see if we see a correlation between when the change is happening and this ratio. And that's a USGS product, I believe, and they recently extended it so it goes further back in time. So I'm really interested in looking. So that might be a good product. They basically took really high res data from the NAIP, the NAPE data set, combined that with Landsat to develop, to calculate vegetation fractions. And then I think it was some kind of machine learning model, but I would look into that. But I think there's a lot of work to be done there. I wanted to get there, but realistically, yeah, next project, but really cool idea. Yeah.
There's some interesting data sets on that from Alex Smith's PhD from VIMS with Matt Kerwin as an advisor, who looked at SET data that looked even at the micro scale, that with marsh collapse, you could see the fragmentation. So good place to look.
Yes. Hi, I have a question regarding the origin and lability of organic matter that gets from the land, let's say from the lower rivers, and then Mead Allison discussed that all the changes that can happen in that part of the river, and I agree that's probably something very relevant that's been understudied. And so this type of organic matter, the lability of it will really matters when it comes to the deposition in the delta and the fate that's going to have. I was wondering, like Marisa, that the different types you showed, if you ever seen in the systems that you looked at, the river and phytoplankton, so the in situ production of plants from the river, either the plankton or also the other plants. So did you ever mention that, or?
I don't know if you remember the picture of the river that I showed, but it was very turbid and very little light can get into the water column there. And so I don't think, based on the stable isotope measurements we made, primary productivity in the water column was not important in that system. And so I haven't looked. I think it'd be really interesting. So I've done like now these laser diffraction particle size analyzers have cameras on them, and we've looked at algae in them, and I think, and you can see a ton of algae in river waters. So I think that is an important, very labile, highly reactive component that I didn't address.
Yeah, maybe some other parts of the river, I don't know for this one, but maybe some other parts upstream are clear waters also, because in the Rhone River in France, we have evidence of this discharge of very labile plankton from the river. So I think that's something that it's to some instance that we should maybe reconsider and look what role it can play in the delivery of labile carbon, because at the end of it, there's also all this priming stuff that someone quoted. Sorry, I don't recall, but I think that's you. Yeah. So this priming effect that can also play a very important role in the storage versus recycling of carbon in the delta itself. So
Yeah, I didn't elaborate much during the short talk, but we do see when the Clearwater rivers like the Rio Tapajos, which is green, practically full of algae, when it mixes with the brown Amazon where there's no primary production, you see priming of breakdown of the more recalcitrant stuff. So the stuff that like lignin and things like that you'd think would be really, refractory turns labile like that when you combine the algae with it. And we see that at the mouth of the river too, where you're mixing blue/green seawater with the brown Amazon water. I always find it funny to think about like particulate carbon loads too. You see literal islands of floating macrophytes going out to the ocean, like actual plants going out to the ocean. So that's a massive just POC flux in itself too. Yeah.
Yeah, can I also add, it's worth mentioning, it's a really good point, and certainly I could have added that in talking about in the backwater reach, sort of this dropout of material onto the bed. That Tom Bianchi's group did a couple of studies in the lower Mississippi that showed a greening of the river, right? And it's very much dominated by diatoms that can respond really quickly in a moving water mass when you get light penetration. And so I think it's a really good point that should be studied in other systems, that this greening suddenly injects this labile carbon into the system, and it also gets into this bed storage, and so it's mixed into this stuff on the bottom and helps to drive remineralization on the bottom, and then all the products are flushed to the shelf again. And so that there are not many systems that's really been studied in, but it's certainly true that greening is a fairly universal, I think, during these periods of low discharge in rivers.
So, I think this will be sort of a question for many of you. And so what I was kind of seeing through a number of the talks was a bit of elevation. And so maybe just comment on, what's our understanding of, I would say, on the aerial side of things, what the role of microtopography plays in understanding, I would say, vegetation dynamics and vegetation resilience, but also maybe, are there any maybe sort of shorter spatial teleconnections between changes in maybe the thaw weg or changes in bed elevation upstream and what that means out for the outer parts of the delta?
Well, I'll start things off. Thanks very much for that question. For the first part of that question, I could probably answer a little bit that is basically the basic of ecogeomorphic cycling in wetland systems, right? They're looking really particularly at elevation and the hydro period, how much water is being inundated over what period of time, how much sediment is then coming in from that water column, how much trapping is happening from the density of the stems that particular species is, and then how much below ground biomass or leaf litter is actually being deposited and then entrained as well as that inorganic material. So I do think an important component is also really bringing into light that decomposition that could happen then with depth. So having instruments that could look at those kinds of rates. I know there's lots of people who use leaf litter bags and other kind of mechanisms to get at that. But every system has got a different tidal range, right? Every system has a different range of species that are dominating, whether or not it's saltwater, saline conditions versus freshwater conditions. So very complicated question for sure. And I think that's what a lot of observational studies, but then also working with modelers like Kendall Valentine, Giulio Mariotti, others. Goodness, we could probably name a million papers that cover just from that. I didn't know if anybody else wanted to tackle that question or Mead for the channel bed.
Yeah, I'm not sure that's good. Certainly there.
Here we go.
So I guess specific to the channel bed, what's your point?
So just thinking about if there are certain teleconnections, like if something happens upstream, something changes in that sort of bed geomorphology, a big, flood comes out, changes that topography. I mean, we don't see that. We're not measuring, I think, too often. Maybe I'm wrong in terms of bathymetry, but how does bathymetry change downstream from something that's happening upstream? Are there things that link that to understanding the system more?
Well, I mean, I'll give you an example. You build a dam on a river, you build a reservoir, there's a longitudinal profile adjustment, right? We've seen it in multiple rivers. There's down cutting. The longitudinal profile adjusts, takes decades, maybe centuries to reverberate downstream. So yes, that's changing a source of sediment into the system. It's putting more sediment from bed incision into the system. Is that you know, that was kind of one of the points of my talk. Is that something from a volumetric point of view that's significant? Another example is, like you said, a very large flood. And there've been a lot of papers written by sediment transport people in rivers that have tried to track sort of longer term effects of a big flood in a system, and whether there's a step function and then the bed adjusts to itself. The real problem with these kind of things it goes back to grain size, right? The coarser the grain size in the system, the longer the residence time it takes for it to work its way. So you can envision a coarse sand particle could take decades to hundreds of years to get from the catchment to the river mouth. And so the effects of a single flood can be muted by sort of this long drawn out transport system, particularly in larger rivers. So I mean, those things are out there. I personally think those are like second order things that we better solve the first order ones before we tackle the second order ones, but.
It's me? Okay. Thanks everyone. This is like a lot of powerful delta energy coming from the stage right now. My question is ostensibly targeted at Carol and Mead, but I think anyone could probably comment on it. You both spoke to strong seasonal patterns in these systems, the monsoon and this kind of floodplain re-wetting. And I'm thinking then about bridging those seasonal patterns to longer term kind of stratigraphic work. And sometimes the seasonal pattern gives a clear facie, and sometimes it confounds a more annual scale dynamic. So I'm curious if you could just speak to, you know, when is the season useful? When is it when is it complicating? What thoughts might you have there on bridging those timescales?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, interesting question. I guess I would speak first to the system that I spoke about today, the GB system, because it's extremely seasonal with that monsoon season. We definitely see a lot of seasonality with the sedimentation and actually the grain size in different regions. So when you go offshore of that river mouth, there's really clear pulses of the monsoon sediments versus others. There's also really clear indications of just even spring and neap tidal cycles sometimes. If we're in a preservational area where it's all getting sequestered, basically. So that's kind of a cool thing to think about. And that's even been preserved for, I'm not sure if it's millions of years, but the actual rocks of the Brahmaputra that have now uplifted in India, they can see these monsoon patterns that are in there. Carbon, I don't know if I know the answer to that. I guess what we were seeing, at least with depth, was that longer term, you know, over a meter. So that should be many decades of sediment layers, you know, no patterns really in that. Everything was really low. So I think that dry season exposure was burning all that carbon. So we weren't seeing a great signature. Now, I don't know if other folks do like more specific, you know, Delta C13, like isotopes might show something more interesting, or recalcitrant versus labile carbon, but it seems to be that in our system most of it was just kind of burned off.
Yes, the way I tried to couch it in my talk is all of that is built in to the longer term record, right? As long as the system is stable, whatever that means, stable. But as we go into the next 100 years, and what we've done in the past 150 years is we've really changed rivers dramatically. You know, I'll give you an example of back to the damming thing. If you do large scale damming on a river, and then you start to operate reservoirs in a managed way, you take the top off of high discharges for flood control, and you generally raise the low discharges to allow increased navigation and things like that in rivers. And so you've altered kind of that hydrological cycle that's natural in the system. And so in the case of what I was talking about, things that go on in the lower river that involve storage and then resuspension of material out to the shelf, that may have gone that way for 1,000 years in that particular river channel, but it's probably not in the future going to go in the same way as it did. So that's kind of the way I want to think about it, is sort of as we change these systems dramatically through engineering or through climate change, you know, how will that change many of these different mechanisms? And is that really important from a carbon cycling point of view?
I can add to it too, thinking even longer time scale, like lobe dynamics time scales in the Ganges Brahmaputra. When the big rivers, the Ganges or the Brahmaputra shift, they're excavating down to depths of 20 meters, and because they're very large. And so that effectively blows out and remobilizes whatever's been stored over the last several thousand years in that location, similar to what Mead was talking about with channels migrating. And what type of pulse that might create to the deeper ocean or what impact that has on the carbon cycle, I don't know, but it's another process that's embedded there.
I guess it's me. Question for Kendall. So with your model, and you went through it somewhat quick, but with the biofilm addition, did that change kind of your underlying kind of finding that the Loch Ness material was really important in the tipping point? Because now that you've added basically something that's growing in place and it's building up stuff, and if anything, maybe stimulating other things to come and chew down the sediment in that area. So, I mean, if I remember correctly, you had how it changed elevation, but did it change the distribution of carbon and the importance of the carbon source?
Great question. Yeah, so it did. And so it did cut off that allochthonous sediment supply, similar to what had happened when I just turned it off, but it still had some allochthonous. But what happened is there was an offset, then the primary production in situ autochthonous carbon went up in the marsh. And so we had a much more autochthonous pool in the marsh. So it shifted away, you know, it was 50% autochthonous in the original. It shifted more towards autochthonous. So you have partial compensation by the vegetation. Now that's of course elevation dependent of that marsh. So, and then what was particularly interesting to me is, yeah, that marsh total carbon stayed relatively stable. So there was that compensation, but it was really that mud flat trapping that allochthonous material, basically what I'm interpreting as mineral associated organic matter in that layer. I also didn't show, but I ran experiments. So the one I showed was if biofilms didn't add any carbon themselves, but I've done experiments with Tracy Quirk, which we looked at if you have rapid accumulation of sediments, you can store the labile material from biofilms. And so if I allowed them to add carbon, it even exacerbated the difference. So kind of fun. Biofilms are super cool and important, and I could talk about them forever.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, Kendall, I agree. But I have a different question, and I feel my head is spinning, and I'm trying to synthesize what's the main message here, because all of you have raised so many good points, and they're so complex and really depends on the systems we study. And so I wonder if I wanted to model now deltas, and my aim is to store the carbon as long as possible. And I want to understand how long does the carbon stay in my delta, and under which conditions does it disappear, and how can I avoid that? What is then the main carbon transport that I need to model? Because from my perspective, I've always thought about carbon in marshes. So how much blue carbon do we have? How long does it stay there? And marshes die, it will disappear basically. Today I learned, well, the inorganic carbon that coming in and that's in the sand is also really important. So what is the general feeling if I had to make a choice in a model, which you always have to make, which type of carbon is the most important to model? Also with regard to transport from the river, the POC that we heard about. So is there a general feeling of what you say? Yeah, this is definitely what you need to put in your model. And don't say everything, please.
I would say exposure to oxygen is probably the most important thing you need. When and why is a molecule of carbon exposed to oxygen? If it's connected to a mineral and it sinks and gets buried in anoxic sediments, groovy. If it gets remobilized into an oxic environment, then it's leaky.
So I don't know the answer to this, but I love vegetation, and I'm always like, vegetation's very important. But I will say, as a geologist as well, you know, this is what forms the peat basins, right? These are these things that over time they accumulate and they stay there for long periods of time. But somebody could also argue that our oil and gas and such actually comes from the organics that was absorbed onto those particles or dropped out of the marine environment. So that's a hard question. I think the deltaic realm, most of that's going to be like that vegetation that's going to be producing on that platform. Maybe once you go into those coastal ocean waters, then it would be more that primary productivity in the water column. That's my guess that I might just put through there.
Okay, can I add to this?
Yeah.
One system we haven't heard much about is the Congo. And I feel like if something is efficient, it's probably, it's especially not going to be exposed to oxygen, but it needs to go to the abyssal plain as fast as possible, right? So you don't want to store it in marshes because they get reworked as the channel migrates or if sea level rises. But if you can move it out away from the delta and not have, well, yeah, so the delta should be maximally leaky.
It's going to be
For what deltas do we have complete sediment budgets? Other than the Congo? The Congo's the one that I know about, right? 2% of organic carbon storage in the entire Atlantic is in the submarine fan of the Congo.
Was that a question for me?
No, for all of you. For what deltas do we have these complete mass budgets?
I have a delta in my lab.
Yeah. So
that doesn't even work.
Other than I think the Sam Bentley with the Gulf of Papua has, and isn't this what the Miss Delta project is about for?
I mean, I would say Steve Goodbread
completing the
Ganges has a pretty decent mass balance one. That's the best we got. But currently right now with our Miss Delta project, we are working on a mass balance.
So four deltas?
The Rhine too.
Yeah.
Always the Rhine.
Always 5 deltas.
I mean,
that's the error.
I've seen numbers up here with 6, 7, 8 significant figures, and I'd be very happy with 30% or 50% if we can even get numbers for the 50%. So when we say we have a budget, what's an acceptable uncertainty? Sounds really good. In a budget. I mean, when would you say, hey, you've done tons of budgets. When did you say a budget is a budget? When you get 20%?
Yeah, I mean, that's an impossible question, but I would say that I know too many details about what goes into a sediment budget. That's the problem, right? You know, and you talk to a modeler and they're like, well, we're going to use your field data of suspended sediment transport, and that's the mass flux into the system. And I say, well, but you realize that it's probably plus or minus 25 to 50%, depending on, you know, how you do the transect, what type of sampler you use, exactly what depths you sample, etc. And they go, really? So, yeah, I mean, I'm with you. If you're plus or minus 25 to 50%, you're in the ballpark. You're doing pretty darn well, given the complexity of what goes into measurement error, as well as, you know, then you start talking about carbon processing. That's a whole different kettle. So.
But this goes back also to the previous question in terms of carbon components, right? And what we need to measure, what we need to model. And for this mass budgets balances, we need to have, you do need to measure everything, and you need to be able to have different components in the models as well, because even with lateral fluxes, right, where is this carbon going? Is it going back to the atmosphere? It's going to get stored, some of it is going to get stored further downstream in the estuaries or the coastal oceans. So in terms of storage, we also have to think about the system. Are we looking only at the wetland? Are we looking only at coastal habitat, or even a little bit further downstream, where some of this carbon will also be stored?
Thank you all for your talks. I'm learning a lot. And I guess this question is for everyone on the committee, but maybe Kendall in particular. For my own work, I'm thinking a lot about the sourcing of carbon and, allochthonous versus autochthonous carbon and applying stable isotopes to try to distinguish that. I've also more recently run into using environmental DNA, eDNA, to distinguish like which particular species are most responsible for organic carbon in sediments. And I guess sort of a broad question, like what do you think are the opportunities and limitations of using eDNA in delta systems?
So I think we've been living mirror lives because I've been diving into eDNA as well. And I think first off, eDNA is more qualitative, right? We can't get quantitative numbers. And so that becomes a big problem. It's mostly presence absence rather than like how much of a given species is there. And also that DNA could be transported long distances. So I have a colleague who was tracking dolphin eDNA and like how far it could spread within Puget Sound. And so it is not necessarily local and you can get very large outliers. And so I am cautious. I'm using it to try to track different species of biofilms, which those are very prevalent and very abundant. So I think if you're looking for very abundant species, then you're going to have a very good kind of idea of what's there. But like, I got gray whale in my tidal flat sample. So, I'm pretty sure the gray whale was not there. And so I think that is complicating. I'm really interested in looking at, there's kind of more the ancient eDNA going down core, but there's a lot of contamination issues. So I think it's a growing frontier, but it does concern me of that it's more an on-off switch rather than quantitative. Would anybody else like to talk about eDNA?
Sure. Yeah, well, just the lunch lady said the lunch was ready at 1.
Oh.
I don't know if people are happy about this answer or sad.
We have a big breakfast. I think we're good.
But I don't know if we should continue for that long or.
It was a 15-minute break.
Okay, I'll just go ahead. So this is more for the panel. So we had a really good discussion on particulate carbon, CO2 fluxes, organic carbon. So my question is, a lot of the respiration leads to alkalinity production, and that's also a long-term storage of carbon. So if you're trying to budget carbon in a delta, should we consider that? To the back.
You want to take that? I don't answer that. Seen this project.
Sure. Thanks, Kenshin, for bringing up something that we have ignored, I think, but Christoph has done a lot of work on this in Martial. So yes, I do think that alkalinity is important because it's, as we transform this organic carbon into inorganic carbon, we often don't know where that goes and what its fate is. So yeah, it's challenging, but a great point.
Can I ask, I have a question to Jaap. You did this awesome classification of deltas, wave driven, tide driven, all that stuff. At the same time, we heard a lot about, and there is 10,000 of them, but the work's been done in just a couple of them, handful of them. So my question is, can you extrapolate the data that we have right now and understanding of deltaic system right now and apply it to your classification to tell something about the global effect of delta, so carbon uptake, carbon, storage, etc. Or if not, what other information, what other subclasses you need to develop, and can you do it with the method that you're using to being able to apply the data that we already have to your classification?
It's a very good question. It's definitely a direction that I was hoping leaky deltas would get into, or me personally, at least. I'm planning to get into that. I think it's two things. Well, the classification, of course, itself doesn't say anything about carbon. But what you can hopefully do is smarter upscaling. So if you sample correctly across this parameter space of waves and tides and rivers, then you know how to extrapolate to the globe and to see what carbon must be like for deltas that you haven't sampled, right? To make that intercomparison. So that's one thing. A thing I think that is missing for a lot of deltas is grain size distributions, both of the feeding river and also what's left in the delta. We have data for perhaps 40 or 50 deltas, but by far we need a lot more of that to make these meaningful budgets, right? Especially if Marisa talked about how carbon is attached to some particle sizes more than others. So I think we need a lot more. We need to know a lot more of what gets stored in the delta in terms of particle sizes.
Yeah, just would like to come back to this mass balance thing, because I guess I agree with Bob that we're probably far off having budgets for carbon, all types of carbon, including alkalinity. I strongly support that. That the fluxes of alkalinity are really that's one of the key. And there's production these sediments. We have posters on that. Marcel showed that yesterday, and so that there are fluxes of alkalinity out of there for very specific reasons linked to the deltaic behavior, the way it varies some reduced compounds and so on. So that's one point. But the second point, I think we are far off having real carbon budget with all the components dissolved. We talked about DOC and DOCs and other stuff. I like your presentation because it shows like this dynamics, this very strong dynamics, both in types of DOC and also the recycling and export. You didn't talk so much about the export to the outer shelf or to the open zone. But so I think all these components, they need to go into that. So it's one thing to have a mass balance for the particles. So all the particles, you said there were still some things lacking maybe in the grain size of the particles that we don't master so much. But it's another thing to have all the components of carbon dissolved, organic, inorganic, and particulate also. And so I think we're far off. But that could be one aim, or at least of this workshop also, maybe to, if we have some good examples, at least things we think we can rely on, to show maybe the way to go for these mass balances for carbon in there, and maybe give guidelines where others should go to do that. Like in the Rhone River, we haven't a budget so far. So we're going to that, but also we mentioned yesterday the sedimentation rate, just the sedimentation rates in deltas, the burial rate, the preservation of particles and carbon, it's hard to measure. So because we have mostly no real techniques, you showed the differential bathymetry that works in some areas where you have large deposition. So that kind of stuff. So I think we should, that could be one aim of this workshop, to try and see in different typology where we should go.
Agreed.
Agreed.
Yeah, there are more questions. We have time.
So earlier in my career, when I was involved in paleontology quite a bit, it was often emphasized form and function in organisms. And so to make this connection between the forms that we see and the function of these forms at any given time in the carbon cycle seems to me to be what we have to do. And so one of the things I was talking about yesterday was that seasonally you can cycle through all these factors which are governing form. You can cycle through them and they create different responses and fluxes of carbon as a result. So I'm wondering how we can go from geomorphological parameters to understanding what functional significance they have, the time dependence that they have, the fluxes that they're associated with in any way. I mean, how can we make that connection?
Yes.
Anyone have any thoughts?
Mark, do you want to give an answer or a question? Question?
Oh, yeah.
I thought you had an answer.
Can I?
Yeah. No, we were, yeah, we were saying that first you need to start thinking about which forms you want to discretize into, right? In this natural continuum of a delta. So we could look, for example, at the relatively onshore inland clastic skeleton of the delta, the sand, the channel bodies, the overbank deposits as one generalized form. And then the next step would be looking at the wetlands and the sort of fringe part of the delta, these very organic rich settings, and moving from that to the offshore and subaqueous deposits, what's getting exported. And all of those will have different time scales and different amounts of carbon sequestration, different processes. So to generalize these forms, generalize the way they function, and then try to put numbers on it.
Anyone else? Great.
Oh, my fellow question. So I'm honored to ask a fellow question. So the first is that I don't know whether someone have looked at like a SIM6 or SIM5 like a global carbon, especially in like ocean atmospheric carbon CO2 flux simulations. So how do you think of? I think according to their course resolution, definitely they can't resolve the like deltas and actuaries. So how do you think this kind of limitation has actually biased like their current global carbon simulation and also climate simulations? And another question maybe is that as we know that like deltas is a so complex system. So whether our like this workshop can identify some representative delta system that we have like a very detailed observation that can make our like modelers can test our models on that system that help us can extend our model to the larger scales. So is that possible? Can be done in the workshop? Thank you.
Who knows about this?
Okay, so yeah, so question. So if you were a magician to invent some kind of global observation, what would be the top 3 types of measurement you wish you could have? Like they in terms of data gaps, what are the top 3 measurements?
Do they have to be possible?
Nope.
Well, you guys already kind of do water, all right? You need water, movement of water. Invisible DOM, we can only see CDOM.
I think whole water column measurements too. A lot of what we see from space is just the surface water. So if we can extrapolate carbon concentration to depth.
But if we could just see the CO2 moving between the air-sea interface and land-air interface, we're all good. That's all we need.
Yeah, it's this exchange aspect, right? This exchange of carbon across different systems, and also rates is what we're missing that are important for models. How do we get to rates for transformation?
So it's all about carbon.
That's you. Perfect.
Yes, carbon cycle. Hydrogen.
Well, I think it would be great if we have a remote sensing product that penetrates water. Just deeper than like what we can do right now.
Autonomous has to be some sort of tripod based or buoy based measurements. And we have enough BCG.
Or the rapid response capabilities of satellites that, yeah.
Actually, one of the issue with these transient processes is satellite doesn't usually work. It's cloudy. Many of the time, like the radar works, but the phytoplankton we cannot get. Yeah, storm. Yeah, that messes up our carbon budget.
I have another one to kind of build off Jaap's is bulk density. His models are pretty sensitive to like the grain size / bulk density relationship.
I always want remineralization rate. I'm going to echo what Kendall said in her talk. A lot of our models are pretty sensitive to that, and it's hard to get estimates of that.
Something in a bottle and measure the big
Incubation.
Incubation.
Water column and sediments. Yeah, I'd say.
But if you had a satellite credit that could see a change in space over time with enough resolution, you could get a rate of change. That's
So you need
But you-
geostationary satellites.
geostationary.
We're working on that. Yeah.
You could say there's 1 milligram DOC here and 0.5 there. It takes 2 minutes to get them over there.
I would say that preservation also is important. We could monitor that. It's probably not possible, but
So just both POC content? Or
no, the POC storage, that gets all to get that back to the radio event is.
So we need max accumulation plus, yeah, so we need some sentiment.
That cannot be very important.
I did a lot of stuff.
So Mark, did you get enough sets of 3?
You can see this is going to be amazing. That's all of you for your talk. Yeah.
Yeah, so the two-factor, I would like to get your model perspective. I would maybe there can be redox potential inserted into the system, so it can be a macro measurement. It can be, and then like instantaneous measurement. Maybe it's also cheaper compared to have someone sample. And another one is that for the water sample in the estuary, that's discussed organic matter. It's hard to tell what kind of position there. But if I, for example, look at model how the chemical behavior of that water is, maybe there is a ratio of different functional groups, like the percentage of carbon, like different chemicals, but index, a reactivity index. Not like that. I think you like you do the NMR, you different functional groups, and you know like in that particular asteroid water, what kind of functional group dominates in organic compound in that water, So maybe for the carbonic acid equilibrium in that water, we could have a way to relate with the organic compound inside the water to establish the CO2